Today, we are joined by Lynn Godfrey, Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, where she works every day to help families through one of the most difficult times in their lives. This connection to kids and family has been the cornerstone of Lynn's career. With roles at Nickelodeon, PBS, and child-centered startups, Lynn became a heavyweight in the media space. However, personal and market shifts made her re-examine her trajectory and propelled her into the world of nonprofits, working for industry icons like the American Red Cross, Girl Scouts, and now LLS. When asked about her leadership style, Lynn believes in the power of many and seeks out talented mentors to help her see through her blind spots. From a pre-med major to CMO, Lynn's encountered twists and turns throughout her career, but her passion and commitment to family has remained resolute. Hosted by Youngmi Park, an expert in strategic marketing and executive leadership, let's listen as Lynn Godfrey takes her seat at the table.
All right, Lynn, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you? It's
I'm
good to be
fine.
here.
I'm fine. I'm so pleased to have you here and looking forward to learning more about you. So, you've had so many interesting twists and turns in your career. You know, you've switched industries and job functions. Can you give us just like a high level intro just to get us warmed up?
Sure. Yeah. Stepping back, there are some interesting twists and turns. I do see a connective tissue or thread amongst those twists and turns, but I started off my career post college in advertising, Young and Rubicam, um, on Madison Avenue when the agencies were on Madison Avenue, and I was fortunate enough to work in a lot of new product rollouts, which really introduced me to the broader concept of marketing. Because quite frankly, I went to a liberal arts school, didn't study business. I was pre-med, in fact. And so advertising was a way for me to stretch my creative muscle and do something completely different. But the net result was that I became interested in other aspects of marketing besides just that of advertising. And so that prompted me after about 3 years to go to business school. And then after a short stint in financial services where I realized that really was not my point of passion, I spent the next 12 to 15 years in media, specifically focused on engaging young people and families. So that was everything from, Nickelodeon, MTV, Comedy Central, to PBS Kids, to an internet startup, and then to a UK-based producer of children's content. And it wasn't until I think 2008, the big recession that everyone, felt the pain of, that I, like so many, were put in a position they had to rethink what they were doing. And for me, it was a real pivotal point in my life because I had reached this juncture in my career where I was feeling somewhat burnt out from the media space. I couldn't really, it was super challenging at that time to find what the next opportunity was going to be. And to be honest, it gave me a pause to take a step back and think about, well, what is important to me and how can I reposition myself and be more connected as a more seasoned older person. And at that point, I also was a mother of a young child, like a 2-year-old, to start thinking about, or 3-year-old rather, like what might make sense. And I kept coming back to, really having a greater purpose, really working for organizations that made social impact, and but staying true to my love of supporting families and kids. And as a result, I made this pivot and went to work for New York City Public Housing Authority, which was couldn't find an organization or sector that was more different.
That's right.
And then that set me on my path in nonprofit. Was there for 4 years, Red Cross, Girl Scouts, and now I'm currently at the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Wonderful, wonderful, rich experiences throughout. So I want us to get into all of that. But
sure.
first, starting at the beginning, what was it about marketing more broadly that pulled you out of the advertising business?
Well, as I mentioned, I was fortunate in that I worked on a lot of new product.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, let me back up. I was a media planner, which at that time was all about like, what is the right media, TV, print, radio, digital, that to get your message out, to frame your story, to reach the customers you want to reach.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked on a lot of new product rollouts. So Colgate tartar control toothpaste and Jello pudding snacks, which really required a lot of close work with the brand managers or senior brand directors of those consumer packaged good products.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore got a better understanding how the development of the product, the packaging, where and in what way it was distributed had so much to do with their impact of how we rolled it out from an advertising perspective.
Yep.
And so for me, it was a great way to get, a front row seat to all the various aspects of what it takes to develop, launch, promote a new either brand extension or product in the marketplace. And that just fueled my interest to learn and to understand more. Advertising, I enjoyed so much, the creative process and storytelling,
Right.
but it really opened my perspective, it broadened my perspective. There's so much more to marketing than just that piece. And it became clear that the best way for me to do that was to go to business school, which I did. I went to Kellogg and specialized in marketing. So, but that's what I would say was the big difference. I really want to get my hands involved in all elements of the marketing stream or flow than just the telling the story and getting it out there.
Sure. It's also nice to be the decision maker, I think. Right?
Yes, very much the case. Yeah, it's hard when you're in the agency side in general,
Yes.
because at the end of the day, to your point, it is up to the client to decide, well, that's nice, great advice, you did all this work, but we want to go in this direction anyway. So yeah, that was a big, that was a big influencer as well.
Yeah. The industries that you worked in also, or the sectors really, even more than industries, but within the sectors, the industries too, they all handle marketing differently.
Yes.
So, could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that would be really, really interesting what you've experienced.
Yeah, so I will say it's, when I started off at American Express, I was that was my first, marketing role outside of graduate school. That was working on the core, consumer card. It was all about getting new charge card members. And it was direct mail. Very quantitative and data driven, and a whole level of analysis that coming from my ad agency background, was very different. And so I never thought of marketing from that point of view, through that lens of, yes, you need to know your consumer, but all the data and analytics that goes into reaching them. How do they respond to different messaging criteria? How do they make their purchase decisions, return on ROI, all of those pieces. I think that actually my experience in those days have prepared me for where we are today, where marketing has gone through this evolution. It is much more grounded in data and analytics and understanding how that impacts and informs the decisions that you make. But I would say one of the biggest learnings or impressions that I have from marketing and the difference in the nonprofit world was when I was at MTV Networks, at the time when it was very much up and coming. And we never had a lot of money in marketing. Whether you were at MTV or Nickelodeon, you didn't have a lot of money. And it meant we had to be very scrappy. And we had to work across different channels. Each channel had their own marketing team, but we would often collaborate to figure out how we cross promote and leverage those big seminal moments for the common good, as well as how do you leverage the resources of your partners. And that served me quite well. I think when you move on to nonprofit, yes, depending on the organization, you have limited resources as well.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of how you can work with your partners in this instance, whether they're corporate partners or fundraisers or organizations that support your cause,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out how you can cross promote and or leverage those resources without an outward exchange of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
You know, shared media, earned media, all of those elements become increasingly important. And I think recognizing how to be very nimble and think fast and bring in people who can help you ideate to be solution oriented and make that happen
Yep.
was a skill set that you didn't always necessarily find in the nonprofit space, but one that was ripe for that approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think in particular, especially when I was at New York Public Housing Authority, which is serving a very diverse audience, a lot of vulnerable communities. I mean, they're either at or below the poverty line. The traditional ways in which you would market were not always the most effective. So you could have a great advertisement or a creative radio spot or something like that, but that often paled in comparison to a really great flyer on an elevator door or frankly engaging members of the public housing communities who were really tapped into what was going on with residents. They were real influencers way before there was such thing as social media influencers who could tell you what's what, and people will go to them for advice, and getting their endorsement would go a long way to getting people interested or aware of whatever efforts you were putting forth. And so it helped me get this appreciation for grassroots marketing in the true sense of grassroots marketing, and that you really need a mix. It's not just one, one channel, one particular media platform that's going to do it for you. You know, you really need to understand that it's a cross-channel multi-mix that's ultimately going to move people to take a certain direction or actions that you want to go in.
Sure. Sure. No, I think that's one of the biggest benefits about making big switches in industry or company and things like that, is you get that additional insight that people just in one industry, they never experience at all. So that's very powerful. Talking about Girl Scouts, were you there? Girl Scouts did a major rejuvenation, or it was bigger than a rebranding, right? They really wanted to refresh everything about Girl Scouts. Were you there?
I was at Girl Scouts for about 5 years, and during that period of time, I drove through a repositioning refresh, which actually is still
undergoing,
in the making, still rolling out. But it was a great opportunity. It's not often as a marketing person you have this opportunity to take this iconic brand that has a very rich history. For the most part, is very beloved and highly trusted, but figuring out how do you draw on its heritage and its legacy and make it, refresh it and make it relevant for a whole new generation of girls and their family members, many of whom may not be as familiar with what Girl Scouts was about.
Right.
The other piece was that you had a situation where I call it, it was not a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the sense that if you ask the average person about Girl Scouts, they'll immediately go to Girl Scout cookies, which was a phenomenal, or is a phenomenal, iconic brand. And it's a program that is close to $1 billion revenue stream for an organization. And it really fuels girls' programmatic experiences locally. And it gives girls also the experience of being an entrepreneur and running a business and marketing it and all of those things. So sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
With the challenges of working from home.
I think everybody understands we're all at home, so these
right, exactly. I'm not even going to go venture to see what that was about. But So it was a great challenge to take that on, and which required, you know, it required not just bringing together people from across the organization, both nationally and across 111 local councils, but it also, and doing consumer research and understanding what's going on in the mindset of girls today,
Mm-hmm.
and parents and family members and caregivers. But it also meant listening, really bringing people along on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Because of how Girl Scouts is structured, each local council is independent and it's its own 501c3. So if you can, it's challenging enough to figure out how do you reposition a brand, and then you need to sell it in, quote unquote,
Yep.
to all your various partners to get them to come on board. So
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that my working in public housing helped me tremendously with that, because
I bet.
yeah, it was very much a case of
Yeah.
doing the traditional tried and true marketing
Yeah.
work, but it was also almost launching a political campaign where you're doing the grassroots,
Uh-huh.
bringing people along for the journey to get them ultimately to buy into it.
Yeah, in many ways, I think it's much tougher to market or even reach goals in those types of situations because there are so many elements that you don't control. And
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Very much the case. You don't always control, well, in this instance, you don't control you have less control over how the brand is represented. Especially if you, depending on, you know, if you have local chapters
Mm-hmm.
who have their own ideas how things should work.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have control because people hold on to, they're so passionate about the brand, they have their own ideas about what it should be, and if you stray too far from that idea, that concept,
Mm-hmm.
it really can derail your efforts. So yeah, a lot of challenges for sure.
Yeah, and in your role now, you've added another layer of complexity because not only do you have people that are very committed to the cause, but you also have to work with medical professionals, right?
Yes,
So
yes,
that's a whole new kind of stakeholder. So tell us
yes.
a little bit about that.
Yes, it is a very, it is a whole different stakeholder.
Mm-hmm.
But they're just that, which is a stakeholder. And I would say that, again, one big difference between generally, my experience, for-profit to nonprofits, is there are going to be multiple stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
So at Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which focuses on blood cancers, of which there are close to 150 or so, developing a relationship with the medical profession, specifically researchers, oncologists,
Mm-hmm.
hematologists who specialize on blood diseases,
Mm-hmm.
the nurses,
Mm-hmm.
and of course patients and their caregivers and volunteers, etc. But understanding those different audiences just under the umbrella of healthcare providers
Mm-hmm.
is really critical, because not only because you want to make sure that we're in our ability to truly serve patients and their families is going to be informed and guided by hearing the perspective of these healthcare providers, but also from a marketing perspective, a very effective way for patients to hear about us and the range of services is through their doctor, is through their nurse,
Right.
is through the oncologist and hematologist. And
Uh,
so who's looking for advice at
yes.
what is, as you could well imagine, the most difficult or painful time in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are many reasons to, again, I just speak to having that consumer focus and understand who in their, if you think of a bullseye, you know, in this instance, a blood cancer patient is the center of the bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
Who are those people who inform them, who support them, who impact them, their decisions that they make or not make, and who are the ones that can serve as your advocates, who are or constituents who can further advance your marketing efforts and or cause and help you tell your story, and in many ways much more effectively than even you, because they have that additional credibility. And understanding that outer circle. So if you use the analogy of a bullseye, where in the center is the consumer, in my instance, in my example would be the patient who's just discovered that they have leukemia, lymphoma, they have a blood cancer. Understanding who in the outer ring, who are those constituents who have the most direct impact on that patient and the decisions that they make. There might be a family member, their doctor, a friend. It could be a research organization, the nurse who they see every day who helps them make appointments. I mean, really understanding who that circle, that influencer ring or group is critical, not only in terms of helping you better understand the mindset and the decision-making process on the point of the patient in the center bullseye, but also how you can engage those influencers or those stakeholders to even more effectively help you tell your story, or can champion, elevate your cause. How can you engage them so that they're aware of your services and what you have to offer, so they in turn can help the core consumer or patient in this instance make smart, effective choices.
So in developing leadership skills, or developing as a manager in general, would you say that successes have been more important to development or setbacks? Because there's a whole theory that's saying that leaders become leaders when they emerge through crises, through crucibles, right?
Yeah, I am of the school of setbacks. Successes are always great, and you can learn a lot from successes for sure. But I do believe that, and this is something that I was reinforced in my time at Girl Scouts, that failing early and often really will help you be a stronger leader, because nothing is ever going to work perfectly. And it's in those periods of adversity that it often prompts you to be more creative and more resourceful, that you become more comfortable with being uncomfortable and thinking about like what's possible. So during this time that we're in, which is unprecedented at times, one of the things that I've been saying or trying to reinforce to my team is to say that the world as we've known it has shifted, and it's not going to go back. Regardless, whenever we get a vaccine, whenever that emerges, it's not going to be returned to business as usual. But let's think of it as almost something that's liberating, because now you're in an environment where the old rules don't apply. What are the new rules?
Right.
What are the new ways that we can approach things? And giving, I think, your team and yourself that permission to try and fail or make mistakes is, when you think about it, very liberating, because often you're going to do something that you would have been hesitant to, that now recognizing you've taken the fear of failure off the table. Oh, okay. I'm going to go for it. And regardless of whatever the outcome is, ideally you'll feel like you've been the better for that, for going for it. I can say that looking back, whenever I took on roles or challenges that were out of my comfort zone, while I may not have navigated them perfectly, it prepared me for the next situation where I was thrown out of my comfort zone, because I already knew that I had experienced that feeling before and had figured out how to navigate it. And so it just made me more comfortable and confident saying, okay, well, I'm out of my comfort zone, but I'm gonna work through it.
That's a super important attitude and skill set to have in today's world. So, but
Yeah,
let's get a little bit more specific because I think this is a really important point. So I also
sure.
agree that setbacks can be more educational. Can you tell us about one that was, you know, especially important developmental milestone for you, and you know what you took away from that?
Yeah, a professional setback, you mean, versus a
Well,
personal one?
so you know, we can learn professional skills from many sources. So it could have
Yeah,
been
yeah,
a personal one as well. So whatever created Lynn Godfrey as we know her today. Yeah.
yeah. So I'll share a personal one because
Okay.
that, um, in thinking about the conversation we're going to have, and what were pivotal moments in my life, I will say a conversation, especially when you, as a woman, you often think about this balance of work and family and children and how do you make it work and trade-offs. And
Yep.
I think I referenced that time in 2008 where it was a big recession and everyone was losing their jobs. I mean, it was a very difficult time for so
Yes.
many people, for me professionally, because I
It
was
changed the world. Yeah.
doing some consulting, but in the end of the day, it was tough.
Yes.
I was also going through a personal challenge of my husband and I were separating and divorcing. And here I had a 4-year-old daughter
Wow.
during a time where the country was in the midst of a recession.
Mm,
And so a lot of external dynamics that you don't have any control over,
mhm,
personal dynamics that were very disruptive. To some extent, you have some control, but maybe not.
mhm,
Um, but that is when I made a lot of took a step back and did a lot of soul searching and made that decision to, or really helped me focus on what was most important. And that was what all of those factors contributed to my decision to say, you know what, I'm not going to pursue media anymore. Maybe that's not where it's at for me right now in this part of my life. I really want to do something that's making much more of a difference and impact. That's what's important to me.
mhm,
Um, and that decision then to make that pivot, but also to be more open to go into a sector and work for organizations that were completely new and different to me, for me, was also spurred by the fact that I was a mother of a young daughter, and I had to be even more, uh, not just strong, but more financially secure, perhaps,
mhm,
than how am I going to get back on my feet? And there was much more of a sense of urgency and need to do that because now I was responsible for my
mhm,
daughter. And
mm,
so, if not for all of those various factors swirling around, could I sit here now and tell you I'd be where I am? I'm not quite so sure. But I
mm,
will tell you, it gave me the focus and the maybe a little fearlessness, or the ability to move forward in the face of fear, to take on roles, to move into organizations that perhaps I would not have considered otherwise.
Stepping back again, um, navigating as a single mom, new territory, world is changing, and all of that. Um, for our audience members, what were some of the outside resources that you found were important to helping you, you know, stay connected, succeed, find opportunities? You know, what's some advice that you can give to our audience members?
I say this being someone who's never been great at networking.
Mhm,
A network, especially when I was younger, I really did not
mhm,
like whatever I thought the concept of networking was. That was just not in my comfort zone. It's something that I've had to become comfortable with.
mhm,
But that said, I do enjoy connecting with people and developing, relationships with them. And that is really what networking is.
mhm,
So I redefined it on terms that made sense for me, I guess I could say.
mhm. Yeah.
So I think it's important that whatever work environment, whether it's a new company or a new group, it's figuring out who your people are.
Mhm,
If I'll use that example, if anyone in the audience was a Grey's Anatomy watchers or fans, there was a dynamic between the two characters and you're like, you're my person. I think you need to find who is your person.
Right.
They may likely be someone who's not even in the same department as you. They could be completely different backgrounds, but yet they're the person you can go to and confide in and say, I don't know how to navigate this or figure that out. And they're really vested in you. You can develop that type of dynamic where you're vested in each other's collective success.
Right.
Developing that, I think, is really figuring that out and developing those relationships both within your organization or even outside of the organization, whether it be through associations or today clearly via LinkedIn and there's so many sources for which you can cultivate those types of relationships with folks. It's easier now than what it was certainly for me when I was just starting out.
For women who want to advance into leadership roles in our audience, is there one tip for you? It's not always easy to get a promotion or to go after a bigger job. So what's something that worked for you that maybe they can consider?
Don't hold your hand down, raise it. Because even if you don't necessarily, if it doesn't end up that you got the position or promotion or whatever the case may be, you'll still have gone through experience, which could be very beneficial.
Yeah.
And then the other is related to that is always take the meeting. If someone reaches out to you to say, hey, I have this opportunity, there are many different ways you could talk yourself out of it, but go ahead and have the conversation. Engage with whomever it is who's reached out to you, because you never know. It may not be the right opportunity for you then, but that could lead to something else later on, or at the very least you find out what's just going on in the marketplace. I think that's very helpful as well.
Right. I also like very much what you said at the start of your answer about you have to speak up for yourself and tell people, because they don't know you, you know you. And I think that a lot of women have the tendency where when somebody says, but you're not qualified, they say, oh, yes, you know better. And, why? That's, how could they possibly know you're not qualified?
Right.
They haven't lived your life, right?
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
go for it. And then there's one other thing I would just say. When I was interviewing for a position, and it was going to be a promotion, but they weren't able to meet exactly my salary expectations. So I could have said at that point, well, you know what, never mind. But I instead offered up, okay, how about you change let's change the title. It was, communications director to chief communications officer. And that made all the difference for me in the longer term. Yes, I didn't quite command the salary that I would have liked, and I had to figure out how to make that work. But by my boss or the decision maker saying, okay, you know what? Yeah, we could do that. The salary was still the same, but it helped propel me for other like-minded senior level roles, because I offered up an alternative that I knew was going to advance my career in many instances. And then, the compensation in this particular instance came later on. I had to wait a little bit longer for it, but it came.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. There's always an opportunity to change the picture a little bit. So that's very smart. That's very smart. So stepping back again, the world is changing so fast. I only have two more questions. So what do you hope will be different about the workforce by the time your daughter is ready to enter?
Oh, wow. Well, let's see. She's 16, so when she enters the workforce. So, first, as a African-American woman with a daughter who's African-American, I would say my hope is that she would enter a workforce that is truly much more diverse. And I mean that in the sense of it's much more reflective of the racial diversity, yes, cultural diversity in our country. And so as opposed to perhaps just being one or two, you know, at a senior level position or in the room, in the meeting, you know, she will look around and see a whole wonderful hodgepodge array of faces, which would be exciting.
Yes.
I think. The other is just much more flexibility. It'll be interesting to see what happens with all this work remote. Because I think this idea of going to work and working in an office from 8 to 5 or 9 to 6 or 9 to 5, whatever, is going to go out the window. And there's recognition that work can mean different things to different people depending on your dynamic. So hopefully much more flexibility. And also I hope that she will be spurred by continual learning. Things are changing so rapidly that what's clear is that this idea of working in a job in a few years, the job that you take on today in a year, let alone 6 months, could be require so many different sets of skills.
We can't even imagine what they might require.
I'm sure. Right. Whatever the new industries and jobs that will be created or haven't even been created yet. So what I would just sort of say is being nimble and recognizing that have a love of learning and of curiosity, and okay, I let me figure out how I have this interest, let me figure out I can learn about it. So I can get myself into that. You know, that zest for continual learning, I think that's a hope I have for her too.
That's very consistent with the tenor of your whole interview. Lynn, it's been such a pleasure to get to know you better today. I wish we had a whole other hour to go a little bit deeper, but you gave us a lot of wisdom, a lot of wonderful food for thought, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've loved it. Thank you so much.
Much appreciation to our partners for their support. And now we open the floor to questions. And Yang Mi will be our moderator. Please feel free to use the chat to ask Lynn any questions you may have after this amazing interview. Yang Mi, please take it from here.
Hi, thank you, Esther. And Lynn, it's so nice to see you again and be refreshed about that wonderful conversation we had. So
yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off, as Esther said, please, members of the audience, send in your questions. I know I've been reading the chat, and I know a lot of you resonated with a lot of what Lynn said, but she has so much more wisdom to share. But I'm going to kick it off with some questions that we got from people as they registered. So Lynn, the first question is, as a younger female in the room, how do you get older colleagues to take you seriously or listen to you?
Yeah, so here's the deal. And again, coming from Girl Scouts, I can tell you age, you're at a huge advantage as a young person. I don't think there's ever been a generation, the Generation Z, high school, middle school, high school, have ever been so smart, savvy, and empowered to wield their digital tools than this group. And coming from an organization that was very much grounded and tried to stay focused on what girls wanted, young people, I can tell you that we benefited as an organization by listening to those youngest voices in the room. So I would hope that any young woman will not be deterred by whatever age difference is, because there's an increasing recognition, depending on what industry you're in, you know, for-profit, nonprofit, and you see it playing out just in the public sphere, issues of social activism, the Parkland students who were able to accomplish amazing things on a worldwide platform in a short period of time when they in theory didn't have jobs, major necessarily in influential connections, money, et cetera. Look what they were able to accomplish. So I think increasingly there's an acknowledgement of what young people bring to the table. And companies and organizations also recognize when they think about their future growth and development, they need to do all they can to recruit and retain, importantly, retain young, fresh talent and perspectives. So I would just say, don't let any age disparities, again, I say this not agnostic to whatever the industry is, be a deterrent for you. You know, raise your hand, raise your, proudly send that idea up, email, have that conversation with someone who, is leading your team, or you see someone leading an effort that you want to get involved in, and offer up proactively your ideas. And you will, I think you may be surprised about the receptiveness and the openness with which people want to hear your voice.
Great, well said. And I absolutely agree. It seems like at no other point in history have we needed to hear from all the voices in the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So kind of similar question for somebody a little bit further on in their career, but along the way up, when did you feel comfortable describing yourself as a strategic communicator? When could you own what you had grown into?
So again, I'm going to reference my Girl Scout experience. I think I certainly shared in the interview, the recorded interview, that organization was challenging to navigate because of the, national and then the 111 independent councils. And so all run by really strong, dynamic leaders who were making decisions based on what worked well, for their respective constituents in the local market. And that often meant not necessarily going along with it, whatever national had to say. And so when I was, stewarding and leading the development and rollout of this whole new brand positioning and platform, one of the major milestones was going to a senior leadership meeting of 500 CEOs in one big ballroom, basically standing on the stage and presenting this case for change and what the change was. And this group of CEOs, majority of whom were women, but were not shy, without a doubt, of being of vocalizing their concerns or any issues, or this won't work for us. I mean, in real time in the meeting, having gone to some of these meetings in the past. So I will say this is where my past work in advertising really helped. This certainly is when my work at New York Public Housing helped, because there's nothing like going to a town hall and being yelled at and told off by some very unhappy residents who were unhappy with their landlord, to give you some to toughen you up and have you think about how do you engage people in a constructive conversation. That served me well in this instance, because I gave this presentation and tried to really make it about storytelling, keeping in mind what's, in advance what some of their issues and concerns would be, and being sure to preemptively address them or tackle them. And then, and the presentation was extremely well received. I mean, it went so much better than I had ever anticipated. And I think that was for me that moment of, oh wow, I do this. I'm not so bad. I'm good at weaving a tale, certainly, to get people to that touches people's emotions and hearts and minds. Obviously that was one major step in a whole succession of steps, but that would be a point I can think of where I thought, okay, I there's a little something I have here that I can make work.
Fantastic. All right, so another question from the registrations, that's kind of a preview to a question from the audience that came in. As a woman of color, what has been your most valuable lesson at getting a seat at the table?
A valuable lesson as a woman of color. Well, having a seat. I mean, well, this is an overused analogy. Sort of, if there isn't a seat, bring your own chair. Like, figure out a way to get yourself in the room. Or maybe I'll use a Hamilton reference. You want to be in the room where it happens. That's, I think, the most important thing. And hopefully then once you get in the room, you can get a seat in a regular seat. That's important. You know, I think in marketing, when you look at brands and companies, what have you, that may have made some missteps, it's because they have not necessarily had the right representation or diversity of voices and perspectives in the room as they were figuring things out. And so I think there, not only for me personally, is there a moral, ethical reason to have benefits to having more diversity around the table, but there's also a strong business case, just given the changing demographics and landscape in the country. And you certainly have seen that over the past couple of months. So anyone who's savvy and smart as a leader, who can look around their room or their conference room and their table and they say, wow, we really don't have the representation we need, whether it be from a perspective of a woman or a person of color or gender identity, or whatever the case may be, it's going to serve you well to propel your organization, your business, if you have a multitude of voices, because the people you're trying to engage represent a richly diverse landscape. Those who come to terms with that and make some efforts to address that are going to be well served. And you, whether you're a woman of color, or again, whatever what defines uniquely you have your own voice to share. So I would say if you're concerned, you're an organization, you're concerned about the lack of representation, then I would encourage you, again, not recognizing the cultural dynamics, talk to the person who heads your team, talk to someone who perhaps is leading an initiative that you're interested in, but you have some ideas about. You know, there's nothing beats sending out an email. Oh, I heard you're doing such and such. I'd love to talk to you about it. You may be very surprised by how it's received, and someone may take you up on your offer and your outreach. I would say, you know, not to be shy to see how you can get involved in a particular, whether within your own group or others, whatever that next generation is. And I will say, in particular, in light of the Black Lives Matter national awareness and movement, at no other time, frankly, has there been this opportunity and receptiveness to hearing from diversity of voices. So I would seize upon it for sure.
Yeah. So two questions came in the chat now that also are related to another question that came in during registration about how to expand diversity in your organization. So Sedne wants to know about how to do this without coming off as a rough feminist in a STEM environment. And Diana also asked, how does it feel? You know, have you ever felt like the token female in the room? How have you dealt with this dynamic? How do you increase this in an environment that maybe traditionally doesn't have a lot of women? And
yeah, you know, that's an interesting question for me, because I have to say, when I think back along my career, most of the industries and organizations I've worked for had a lot of women. So advertising, certainly in media, then in entertainment. I was at Nickelodeon, which this was in the early 90s, and our CEO, the president of Nickelodeon, was a woman. So I will say, I haven't necessarily experienced this being a token woman in the room. I mean, the biggest difference might be when I was at New York Public Housing, which, yes, there was a chairman, and you know, there were a lot of senior roles amongst men, but there was an equal representation with women. So I can't answer that question as the token woman. What I can answer is as a token woman of color. That I for sure can answer. And I would say that, you know, for those women of color who are maybe on this call, I think it's safe to say your experience, depending on where you grew up and where you went to school, you may have always been a token. I'm pretty safe in saying that at some point in your life, you've experienced where you've been the only one in the room, only one in the classroom, only one in the gym class, only one in, you know, on your vacation, who knows, in the hotel. It depends, but it's not unusual to feel that way, frankly, as a person of color. And I think you get used to that dynamic. And so for me, I would just say that I try not to be, I have learned to be comfortable in that being the only one, and therefore, because I'm the only one, I feel an additional sense, and certainly at the senior level, I feel an additional obligation and responsibility, not to necessarily to be the speaker for all people of color, because I can't do that, but certainly being very vocal and proactively offering up my opinion and making sure I have something concrete and substantive to say and add to the conversation to advance it forward. And when, as in most recently, there have been so many conversations in boardrooms and what have you about, well, how do we tackle diversity, and how, you know, at senior levels at the board, I have felt compelled, and I have, you know, proactively initiated conversations with, you know, from president on down about, look, this is what needs to change, and this is why it needs to change. And, you know, if you make it in terms of not just because, again, the it's a moral, you know, it's a right thing to do, but also if you couch it in the context of it's sound business strategy, it's hard to necessarily dispute that. So that's what I would say. I hope that's been helpful.
Great. And another kind of question that came in before about positioning yourself for success after a round of layoffs was also echoed in the chat by Jennifer, who's asking, what kind of advice can you offer us seeking work due to pandemic layoffs, trying to network and prove capabilities while also having children at home?
Yeah, that is for sure tough. Even if you haven't been laid off, managing work with potentially homeschooling, maybe it's the absence of childcare. Clearly that's a huge issue. And in fact, I saw an article recently which said that women during this period of COVID are 3 times more likely than men to stop working or put their career on pause because of issues of childcare. So that is for sure a real challenge. What I would say to someone who maybe has found themselves that their role has been eliminated, or they're trying to figure out how to balance all of that, is that while a lot of organizations and companies have had to make the difficult decisions to lay people off, in many instances the work still has to go forward. And so while they may not have a full-time opportunity, it does raise opportunities for freelance work or project work. Which is helpful. And this is where tapping your network, and obviously LinkedIn being the most obvious, you know, going to those, revisiting those former colleagues, past bosses, you know, letting them know and not being shy of the fact that you're looking for consulting opportunities, project opportunities, you know, and letting other people, you know, letting as many people as possible know that you're available for short-term, long-term projects. I think that's really important. I think that in terms of the balancing of the childcare, depending on what your skill set is, and I'm just saying this off the cuff because frankly, I've begun to think, I having a 16-year-old who's a little bit more independent, I nonetheless have had to get involved in her remote learning. And other parents are trying to figure out the same. I don't know if you're really good at if you're really great at coordinating and planning and project management, you could even create your own. You could fill a need, which is, how could I help other people, perhaps in families in my neighborhood, figure out how to support their own respective young person's learning. Maybe it's coordinating a study group and you're doing it on virtual, or you're volunteering for the school district that is trying to figure out how to make it work because they don't have all the answers. Or maybe you're tech savvy and you're you know how to make a Zoom meetings work really effectively, and you want to lend your support or your efforts to an organization, or as I said, the school district or municipality to solve these people, help solve the problem. I guess what I would say is, here's an opportunity to be scrappy, recognizing that there are other people, your neighbors, friends, family members are in the same situation that you're in. How could you turn that into a potential opportunity or a way to leverage your skill set? That's what I would say. I remember a time, not the same thing as what's going on now for sure, but I do remember a time where I was working from home and had my 3-year-old daughter, but didn't have regular childcare, but there were other members of her preschool, the same thing. So I basically said, hey, let's create like a day camp, quote unquote. And we rotated like these 5 kids going to 3 different homes. We shared the cost of one babysitter and we made it work. Now, granted, that's not the same thing because obviously there are additional health and safety issues with COVID, but I do think there's something to recognize, you know, is there a way you can create your own like safe pod, quote unquote, to help provide relief on the child care side? I would just say, let's think about all the possible solutions to this
Right. The underlying message is it's a good time to get creative, and that will also make you stand out. So I love that. Lynn, we have so many more really good and interesting questions, not only from the registration, but they're coming in fast from the chat. But unfortunately, the hour is up. So it's been wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much for sharing your life, your passion, your expertise with us. And I'm going to turn it back to Esther now. So it was delightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Yami, for hosting this amazing interview, and of course, Lynn, for sharing your success story. We hope you all enjoy this virtual conversation and that you join the next one on September 17 with Mani Dasgupta, Vice President of Global Brand, Product, and Content Marketing at IBM Services. And at last, if anyone is interested in learning more about the benefits of becoming an AMA New York member, you can go to amanewyork.org/join. Or if you're interested in, you're a member and you would like to become a volunteer, you can visit amanewyork.org/get-involved-volunteer. Let me share this in the chat. And if you have any other questions, please email us at info@amanewyork.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.